Monkey Business by John Arthur. Richard Clark left his air-conditioned bungalow and stepped straight out into the clammy, oppressive grip of the tropical morning. Before he had walked 100 yards, his thin cotton shirt was clinging to his back in large damp patches. Beads of perspiration trickled from his forehead and into his eyes. He blinked rapidly and flicked the salty droplets from his eyebrows with a time-worn movement of his right hand. He looked out from his elevated vantage point at Pasir Panjang, across the water to where dozens of sea-going freighters sat moored in Singapore harbour, waiting patiently for their cargoes of copra and rubber to be loaded before proceeding on their lazy way around the world. The weather never varied. It was January now, but it could just as well have been June or September. Month to month, day in, day out, the temperature remained at a steady 90 degrees Fahrenheit, extremely high humidity adding to the discomfort. Even the heavy, steaming rain of the monsoon season failed to break the inexorable grip of the equatorial greenhouse heat. Clark was used to it, and the climate no longer bothered him. During the last 6 years he had learned to accept the ways of both the island and its inhabitants. He had reached the stage where he felt that he belonged there as he did nowhere else in the world. He had many friends among both the Caucasian and the Oriental populations, and managed to enjoy a social life which many considered to have died with the end of colonialism. He mixed freely with the natives. The withered, opium-smoking Chinese laundryman, the ebony Indian money-changer, the gold-toothed satay man. They all knew and respected him. He, in turn, acknowledged their beliefs, respected their customs, and was accepted as a friend. Many of his European friends had even said that they suspected that he was beginning to think like an Oriental himself. But he knew only too well that he still had much to learn. In fact, it was his desire to learn and to understand that stopped him ever thinking of England and home. A yellow-topped Mercedes taxi roared past him. He waved to the driver, and the taxi, braking dangerously hard, skidded to a halt in a cloud of red dust some 50 yards farther on down the road. A head popped out of the near side window, and a grinning yellow face called back to him. "Taxi, John?" Clark walked up, climbed into the rear seat, and was thrown violently backwards as the driver put his foot down and they shot off down the road. Clark smiled to himself. After all, he was used to it. "Where to, John?" the driver asked him. To him, everybody was John. "Paya Lebar Airport." $5, okay? He looked at Clark and smiled widely as he asked the question. Clark laughed. "You cheeky sod, what do you think I am, a bloody tourist? $3, and that's all you'll get." "Okay, John, $3.50. $3 only." "Okay, John, $3. The driver was still smiling, and they were friends already. They drove past Collier Quay, up through the city and bustling Chinatown, out to the far side of the island. When they reached the airport, Clark gave the driver $3 plus an extra 50 cents. The young Chinese waved and drove off, grinning even more enormously than before. Clark went to the bar and bought himself a long brandy sour, which he took up to the observation balcony to await the arrival of his client. Within 30 minutes, all being well, Wayne Harrison would arrive and Clark would be there to meet him. They would shake hands, exchange meaningless greetings, and for the next 3 days it would be Clark's duty to escort the American on a lightning tour of Singapore, at the end of which time he would receive the generous sum of $300, American, of course, for services rendered. It was not very demanding work, but it paid well, and that suited Clark admirably. He never experienced difficulty in obtaining clients, as most of the tourists, and especially the Americans, seemed to prefer being shown around by someone who spoke the same language, albeit with a slightly different accent. The only distasteful thing about the work, as far as Clark was concerned, was the people he had to deal with. He saw them as a crowd of pasty-faced, money-spending, camera-clicking, empty-headed idiots who gawked and gasped at anything and everything they saw. Some of them showed disgust at the squalor and filth they found in certain run-down corners of the city, taking it for granted that the sanitary granite and marble civilization of their hometowns was a worldwide heritage. They didn't for one moment attempt to sympathize with the poor or, in any way, to bridge the vast gulf between East and West. They simply stood apart in splendid isolation, clicking their cameras and remaining totally uninvolved. Clark found himself gripping the balcony rail tightly as he thought about it. Perhaps he was, after all, beginning to think like an Oriental. He looked beyond the airfield and saw the giant silver airliner whispering in above the unstirring palm trees. Clark stood outside the arrival lounge and watched through the plate glass window as the motley band of passengers battled their way through customs and immigration. They came in all shapes and sizes, but it wasn't difficult to pick out Harrison. He stood slightly apart from the rest of the passport-waving crowd, a look of childish expectancy on his flabby white face, already pointing and clicking with his camera at anything that took his fancy. Within the space of a minute, he bagged 3 custom officials, a "Welcome to Singapore" sign, written in 4 languages, and several of his fellow passengers. He was a tall man, vastly overweight, with thinning grey hair cropped close to his head. He was wearing a poorly tailored, but undoubtedly expensive, dark blue suit, the baggy trousers of which flapped above a highly polished pair of brown brogue shoes. His crisp white shirt was choked with a bright yellow tie. Clark estimated that he must have been in his early 50s. Obviously overfed, probably overpaid, and well on his way to a coronary thrombosis. Clark waited patiently until Harrison had completed the formalities of arrival and had assembled his luggage before walking over and introducing himself. He tried to appear genial. "Mr. Harrison, I'm Richard Clark. Hope you had a pleasant trip." The American's face split into an over-friendly smile, and he extended a podgy but well-manicured hand. "Well, hello there. Glad you made it on time. Never met a limey yet who wasn't punctual." "Fine, fine." The American's voice, like everything else about him, was too loud. Clark shook the proffered hand, but Harrison withdrew it quickly and raised his camera just in time to snap an attractive young Malay girl, dressed in a sarong kebaya, before she disappeared round a corner of the building. He turned to face Clark once more and gave him a stupid look which seemed to indicate how pleased he was with his sharpshooting. He spoke hurriedly. "Well now, let's get started. Only 3 days here, then I'm off up to Hong Kong on business. Must be plenty to see and tell the folks back home about." They took a taxi back towards the city. Throughout the journey, Harrison used his camera to immortalize anything which was new or strange to him. He captured the noisy, explosive colour of a Chinese funeral procession, the mysterious majesty of a Buddhist temple, the weary face of a trishaw driver, and countless other things besides. The clicking didn't stop until they reached the Goodwood Hotel. The taxi driver winked at Clark as Harrison paid him off in American dollars. Clark winked back and said nothing. After all, he and the driver were in the same business. Clark had expected Harrison to spend the rest of the day settling in at the hotel. Harrison, however, had other ideas. Within 3 hours of his arrival, they were fishing from a sampan off Blackang Mate Island. The big American was in his element, despite the fact that all he caught was an assortment of venomous sea snakes. Twice during the afternoon, Clark and the wildly jabbering boatman had to cut the American's fishing line to prevent him dragging the deadly reptiles into the boat. Harrison's misplaced enthusiasm made him impervious both to their warnings and to the immediate danger. He spent most of the time, however, flat out in the bottom of the boat, with a large straw hat over his face, singing "Home on the Range," while the sun beat mercilessly down upon his rainbow-coloured shirt and his knee-length Bermuda shorts. That same evening they dined sumptuously at the Troika restaurant, and then returned to the Goodwood for a quiet drink and to plan their activities for the coming day. "Tomorrow," said Clark, running his index finger lightly round the lip of his brandy glass, "is Thaipusam." "Taipu what?" exclaimed Harrison, nearly biting through his inevitable cigar. Clark decided to give Harrison the full treatment. In Singapore there are 2 million people, give or take a few thousand. Most of them are Chinese and can be subdivided into groups of Hokkien, Teochew, Cantonese, Hainanese, and Hakka peoples, speaking several different dialects between them. There are also large numbers of Indians, Ceylonese, and Malays. Thaipusam is a Hindu festival, during which the Indian devotees of the faith parade through the streets doing penance. If we watch the parade tomorrow, you may well be amazed, if not a little frightened, by what you see. Those doing penance have their bodies pierced with scores of sharp needles, and sometimes wear sandals which are nothing less than small beds of nails. Others have their noses, tongues, cheeks, any loose skin in fact, skewered with silver arrows or fishing hooks. Clark sat back in the deep leather armchair and paused to see what effect his words had on the American. It annoyed Clark to see that the American was showing mild interest, but nothing more. He continued, "The wearing of the kavadi is yet another form of penance. It consists of a heavy wooden framework and is edged with razor-sharp blades, which rest upon the shoulders of the wearer." Harrison wasn't listening. He was far too preoccupied with the legs of the petite Chinese waitress, whose smooth ivory thigh was showing tantalizingly through the slit in her cheon sam, as she brought fresh drinks to their table. Harrison watched her walk away, then leered across the table at Clark. "Say, is it true what they say about the Chinese?" He laughed loudly, his fat face wobbling with each separate guffaw. Clark experienced what he thought was a suitable feeling of disgust, and at the same time determined to make another assault on the American's credulity in order to regain his interest. The Chinese, whatever may have been said about them, are a very interesting race of people, and their customs are the strangest of all. Once again he sat back and waited for Harrison to take the bait. Harrison was hidden behind a thick cloud of cigar smoke, but he waved it aside impatiently as his curiosity got the better of him. "For instance?" The fish had bitten. Clark was ready to elaborate. "Some sections of the Chinese community consider the head of the songfish to be a great delicacy. They eat every part of it, except for the bone, of course. Strange by Western standards, don't you think? Harrison raised one eyebrow and twisted his slack mouth into a wry smile, but said nothing. Clark warmed to his subject. There is still an isolated group of Old World Chinese here in Singapore who indulge in a ritual which even I refused to believe existed until I actually saw it take place. Harrison was sitting on the edge of his seat, a look of intense interest on his face. Clark was pleased that he had managed to shake Harrison out of his state of apathy. He continued once more. These people believe that the brain of a monkey, if eaten, will increase one's mental capacity, restore virility, and also guarantee long life. However, these qualities are lost unless the brain is removed from the animal while it is still alive and eaten immediately. The unfortunate creature is tightly bound, the top of its skull is removed, and the brain is torn from the cranial cavity to be eaten, if possible, before the furry corpse has stopped twitching. I can assure you that to watch it happen is quite an unnerving experience. Believe me, nothing screams as loudly or as horribly as a petrified monkey. Harrison's expression reflected sheer disbelief. I guess that's one tall story that you guys throw in for the tourists. Hell, I won't believe that until I see it. It's inhuman. Clark smiled. It just depends on your upbringing. After all, we don't all share a common sense of values. The few people who indulge in this sort of thing find it perfectly natural, I assure you. They sat in silence for several minutes. Harrison was still sceptical with regard to what Clark had told him, and he sat deep in thought. When he started to speak, he had changed the subject. I think we agreed on $300. He reached into his hip pocket and produced a bulging wallet from which he took more than the required sum. He leaned forward and handed the money across the table to Clark. I like to settle money matters well in advance. It makes for good service. Besides, if I throw in another 50, maybe you can arrange something special. Clark got the point and, as he took the money, decided that he definitely could arrange something. Harrison seemed to deserve it. Clark hired a car and early the following morning drove back up to the Goodwood. He gathered from what Harrison told him that, after he had left the hotel the night before, the big American had taken a taxi into the city and had found himself a woman. In this way he had managed to discover that what they said about the Chinese was not true at all, and what pleased him most of all was that it had only cost him $20 to put his mind at rest. Clark smiled dutifully when he heard the story, but his thoughts were elsewhere. They spent most of the morning watching the Taipusam procession, during which time Harrison's perennial camera was constantly on the move, busy taking photographs to astound the folks back home. Harrison seemed to enjoy the spectacle, but it was obvious that he wasn't intrigued, as Clark always was, by the strength of the devotees' faith, which enabled them to withstand terrible pain and to escape permanent injury. Later in the day they surveyed the island from the top of Mount Faber, studied minutely the macabre statuettes in the Tiger Balm Gardens, and inspected the dazzling green world of the House of Jade. All the while Clark supplied Harrison with the relevant details. Night found him sitting on a wooden bench outside of a bar in Bugis Street, surrounded by the dregs of humanity. The street was full of pimps, prostitutes, drunks, beggars, peddlers, and pickpockets. Here you were supposed to be able to satisfy any lust, practice any vice, buy anything or anybody. Clark had never had any reason to believe that you couldn't do just that. The place and the people were unique, save for those who had just come to watch. Harrison was greatly amused by the antics of a pair of queers who were trying to solicit the attention of a group of British sailors. It had taken Clark a full 20 minutes to convince him that they were, in fact, male and not female. Harrison hadn't taken his eyes off them since. "I can guarantee," Clark had said, between sips of a long, cool lager beer, "that the most attractive woman in the street at present is a man." Harrison had laughed loudly, too loudly in fact. He wasn't used to a great deal of drink, and it was going to his head. A short while later he lost $5 trying to beat a young Malay boy at Noughts and Crosses. His heavy loss was partly due to the drink, but mainly due to the fact that the boy was a professional, and he was not. Clark sat back and savoured the warm, spicy aroma of the night air. The distinctive smell of fresh durians, displayed on a nearby fruit stall, mingled with the faint odour of beer and the wafting clouds of cooking smoke issuing from countless kitchens. It was the smell of humanity, and Clark loved it. Several drinks later, Clark reintroduced their old topic of conversation. "How would you like to see something a little extreme?" he asked. "What do you mean?" slurred Harrison, his mouth flapping loosely, at the same time slopping a great deal of his beer across the bare wooden table. "A blue movie or something?" "No," replied Clark. Harrison opened his eyes wide and managed a beery smile. "Ah, you mean that damn monkey business?" "Yes, if you still want to see it." Clark waited, with bated breath, for the reply. "Fine. When?" Harrison was hooked. "As soon as you're ready to leave." Within 10 minutes they were driving away from the lights and the sounds of the city. The car bumped along a rough, dark track that led off the main road and down into a black wilderness of rubber and palm trees. The dripping green vegetation and an occasional scuttling rat were all that could be seen within the arc of the headlights. They moved slowly, and somewhere close at hand Clark could hear a colony of bullfrogs booming out their mournful song. Harrison had collapsed in the rear seat. He was snoring loudly, and remained undisturbed by the buffeting he was receiving from the rough passage of the vehicle. Clark caught a glimpse of a rapidly fluttering bat, momentarily caught in the headlights. A short while later an emerald-green snake fled across their path in a lightning whiplash zigzag. After they had travelled a mile or more through the blackness, they came upon a small kampong consisting of several atap huts, grouped closely together in a small clearing. Clark climbed out of the car as an old Chinese, bent double with age, hobbled towards him, carrying an oil lamp. He held the lamp high so that he could see Clark's face more clearly. As soon as he recognized him, he gave a crooked smile of welcome. The flickering lamp cast long shadows and gave the old man's face a satanic appearance. His smiling mouth was a black cave, guarded by a solitary gold tooth and several decaying stumps. Long black hairs drooped down from a large wart on his chin. His heavily lined face took on the appearance of a ploughed field, and his eye sockets looked black and empty. He leaned forward into the light, and his eyes sparkled and came alive when he saw Harrison slumped in the back of the car. "Good, Mr. Clark, you bring us a visitor." Harrison stirred, sat up, shook his head, and with great effort swung his legs out of the car and pulled himself to his feet. He hung on to the open door to steady himself. "Are we there?" he asked in a daze, staring curiously about him with half-closed eyes. "Yes," replied Clark. "Old Lim Chong will take you inside. I'll wait for you here. I've seen it all before." Harrison murmured his assent, and the old Chinese led him towards the nearest hut. He had barely stepped inside before he collapsed on the floor in a senseless heap. The first thing Harrison thought, when he regained consciousness, was how badly he had underestimated the potency of the local beer. He tried to raise a hand to his throbbing head, but found that he was unable to do so. He almost panicked, but managed to fight back his fear and tried his best to assess the situation. His brain was still befuddled, and he couldn't see very well. He was sitting in almost pitch darkness, and he couldn't move his arms or legs. He could see an oil lamp hanging in the doorway, but it was burning so weakly that it shed hardly any light at all. His heart jumped violently when the lamp started to move towards him. He heard a shuffling, and the light became brighter. He was considerably relieved when he saw that it was carried by the old man. Lim Chong turned up the wick of the lamp with a horny hand, and the bare hut was filled with a light that hurt Harrison's eyes. "What's going on?" Harrison shouted. "Where's Clark?" Lim hung the lamp from a wooden beam, then thrust his wizened face close to that of the American. "Mr. Clark not very far away," he breathed softly. Harrison tried to turn his face away from the foul stench that issued from the old man's mouth, but he couldn't move his head either. In a moment of terror, he realized his position. He was stoutly lashed to a heavy wooden chair, and his head was clamped in some kind of wooden vice, which was presumably, in turn, fastened to one of the vertical hut supports somewhere behind him. For some reason, he had been rendered totally immobile. But why? All he knew was that he was scared stiff. "What is it you want? My money? Then take it, but for God's sake get me out of this contraption!" He was screaming, but he couldn't help himself. Lim Chong had moved behind him, and the vile smell returned as the old man whispered in his ear. "No, sir. We no want your money." Harrison only began to realize what it was all about when he experienced the first stinging pain, as Lim Chong deftly drew a razor-edged knife across his forehead, just below the hairline. Then he knew. He struggled like a madman, but to no avail. He screamed for Clark to help him, but when nobody came, he just screamed, and screamed, and kept screaming. The pain was almost unbearable. He could feel the hair and the flesh being ripped and stripped away from his skull, and he could feel the warm, sticky blood seeping down his neck and running down his face, blurring his vision, so that he saw everything through a red mist. His screams increased in both volume and intensity, and his heart pounded in his chest like a sledgehammer. His fear became so total that it began to paralyze him. He could find no strength to continue his useless struggle, and he was finding it hard to breathe. His screams were reduced to babbling pleas for mercy, and finally broke off into hoarse, choking sobs. He began to cry like a child, the salt tears mingling with the blood in his mouth. There was a quick rasping sound and sensation that reached down to every one of his nerve ends. His limb chong started to saw away the obstructive bone. He shivered with horror and stared with disbelief as the brittle white fragments began to litter the floor around him. Harrison moaned and cast his eyes upwards. He saw several wickedly smiling faces before him, all ghastly yellow in the light of the lamp. The terrible thing was that Clark's face was among them. He saw each one of them eagerly raise a claw-like hand towards his head. Their hands remained out of his vision for a few seconds, but he managed to glimpse two of them ravenously stuffing some of the bloody grey spongy matter into their mouths, before everything finally went black. Clark drove slowly back to Pasir Panjang. He knew now that he would never return to England. Business was good, and the mysteries of the Orient fascinated him.